to Shalini, who is going to kick off the next panel, which is on SMEs and startups. Shalini, the floor is yours. If you are here.
I am. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, my video isn't working. So everybody, please excuse me. I have tried and tried over the last 15 minutes. It's not working, which is a pity because I was so looking forward to seeing and being seen. However, let's get started with our wonderful panel number 6. So my name is Shalini Trefzer. I want to thank all of you for being with us here today. I've lived in Switzerland since 2008, and I currently work as a data and AI specialist at Microsoft. So for today, the European Commission has proposed in April this year the first ever legal framework on AI, which together with a coordinated plan with member states is aiming to turn Europe into the global hub for trustworthy artificial intelligence. So this legal framework is taking an approach that is familiar to many of us who live under the laws of this continent, namely building future resilience on a firm foundation of safety and fundamental rights of people and their businesses. So how can SMEs and startups prepare for AI technologies, innovate responsibly, and engage in policy dialogue? In order to answer these questions, our panel will consider the law, the policymaker, the public institution, the foundation, and the private players. So in our panel today are some of the most qualified and passionate people to explore this topic with. I've had the incredible good fortune of speaking to most of them over the past days, and can't wait to share their thoughts with you today. So you can read their complete and very impressive profiles on the official page of the second AI Policy Conference. But let's welcome the panel with a brief introduction of each speaker. I want to start with Dr. Alexander Ilic. Alex is the co-founder and executive director of the ETH AI Center. For those of you who don't know, the ETH is Switzerland's premier public institution of higher learning and technology. Alex has a remarkable energy about him. You see him on video here. Hello, Alex. He has twice been awarded as Entrepreneur of the Year in Switzerland. He is an AI entrepreneur with a track record of selling to millions of customers and successfully selling a computer vision company. Alex is bringing the valuable perspective of productization and how that is helped by designing well. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Anand Rao. Anand is Global AI Lead of PwC. With over 35 years of industry and consulting experience, Anand has received acclaim, widespread recognition for his extraordinary contributions in the field of consulting and artificial intelligence research. Global enterprises are among the top customers of startups, so I urge all the entrepreneurs among us to open your ears wide to Anand's insights. Then I introduce to you Eva Kaili. Eva is the chair, Future of Science and Technology panel at the European Parliament, Brussels, Belgium. As a parliamentarian, Eva is tirelessly involved in creating space for multi-stakeholder voices to be included in AI policy. A former journalist and newscaster, Eva works intensively on promoting innovation as a driving force of the establishment of the European digital single market in her role as a high-ranking and influential member of European Parliament. Welcome, Eva. Now I'd like to introduce you to Julia Reinhardt. Julia is Fellow in Residence, Mozilla Foundation, a privacy professional. As a Mozilla Fellow in Residence, she assesses opportunities and limitations of the European regulatory approach on trustworthy AI in Silicon Valley and its potential for US small businesses and advocacy. As a certified privacy professional, she advises small and medium-sized businesses in the US on compliance with GDPR. A former German diplomat to the US, Julia was also involved in EU negotiations on GDPR and other technology policy issues. Now I'd like to introduce you to Mislav Malenica. He is the CEO of Mindsmiths, president of the Croatian Artificial Intelligence Association, and you see him on camera here. Hi, Mislav. Mislav is an AI engineer and entrepreneur focused on building emotionally intelligent AI solutions that have a positive impact on the world. Currently, the president of the Croatian Artificial Intelligence Association, Mislav works to foster dialogue between startups and policymakers, and he is passionate about fostering incentive structures that encourage innovation. I would like to now introduce you to Niniane Paeffgen, who is our member bringing in the Swiss perspective to this panel. Niniane is the managing director at the Swiss Digital Initiative Foundation. The foundation aims to advance practice-oriented ethics in the digital age. A member of the WEF Global Shapers community, and the WEF stands, of course, for the World Economic Forum. Just a quick reminder. She's also involved with the Swiss think tank on foreign policy and the Davos Digital Council, in addition to past experience in the Security Council Affairs Division at the United Nations. Niniane brings the Swiss perspective on digital ethics and responsible behavior through concrete projects. Now that you've met the panelists, let's get started with the panel. But before we do that and dialogue with these amazing leaders, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the tremendous work that our organizers, Aisha Piatti, Sanya Fabrio of RegHorizon, their teams, the volunteers and the sponsors, and all of us who are speaking today have put into creating this important space. Considering its historical role and contributions, as well as its central, some would say neutral location, one could also argue that Switzerland has a role, perhaps a unique one, in facilitating this long play of AI in the region and beyond, which is why the founders of RegHorizon chose to base it here. So now that we are here in Switzerland, in the center of Europe, let us begin our panel. Eva, I would love to start with you. And while you are taking the floor, I'm going to try a different computer so perhaps we can see each other. Let's start with the legal framework on AI that is currently being examined in the European Parliament, Eva. What would you say to a layperson, just a random person, are the most important intents and components of this legal framework on AI?
First of all, I want to thank you and Ms. Piatti also for inviting me to this event, and I'm very happy to meet all the co-speakers. I wish we had a physical event, but hopefully next time it will be possible. So you're asking a very interesting question, because now we have received the first lines, let's say, the draft on the Artificial Intelligence Act, and already the debate has started on what are the controversial points and what are the points that we will have to debate a bit more before we take final decisions. So I will start with that, because I have the feeling that in the details we have some issues that we can identify. For example, the very positive approach that this file will have is the high and low risk. This means that we will have to have a list with the high risk applications and sectors where the obligations will be much more detailed and strict, and we will have also the low risk, which means it's going to be more easy for newcomers, for smaller companies, that their impact and the potential harm that their technology could do, it's much less. And this means they will have better access to data and, of course, less obligations and requirements. So it's very important to make sure that we understand what are the applications that will be identified as of high risk. Another, I can give you some examples. For example, predictive policing could be a case that we have really to discuss. Facial recognition, it's also very important, especially in public spaces, because if you see the wording of this legislative proposal, it mentions the live in instant biometrics use for face and facial recognition on public spaces. So this means that if there is a delay, and if it's recorded and if it's checked later, maybe this would be allowed. So we have to make sure what kind of biometrics should be shared, and if in public spaces they should be used. Of course, there is a debate also for the exceptions for terrorism, for kidnaps of children, and how much encryption we should expect, and if we should at all have any backdoors. So there are very strong positions in both sides. I believe we can have both. So I believe that technologically we can explore solutions in order to understand if the content is, let's say, illegal, and then be able to take further actions. So we have also governmental scoring. So this is not the scoring of a company, it's of government, social ranking. This is in the list of being banned from using. I have the feeling also that here we have to discuss about the human oversight that we want to have in all these policies, because just a few days ago, I'm sure you're all aware, UK suggested that there should not be, it's not needed to have human oversight of autonomous decisions taken by algorithms, which is in contradiction to what EU is expecting to have. So we are in a different direction. These are some of the initial issues that we'll touch, but then of course we have the conformity assessment. So it's very interesting to see how much self-regulation it will include, and companies will have to meet if there's going to be checks and inspections by the member states, or if it's going to be a central artificial intelligence board, or if it's going to be the data protection authorities to take this task to apply, implement, and enforce these the rules, and make sure that they will monitor the AI during its whole life cycle. I think it's very interesting also to understand the challenges we have of a technology that is developing constantly. And we start to talk about automation, but also in the end, we have to understand that we talk also about autonomous systems, which means not just to solve problems, but also take decisions and have full control of the process. And this is where we need to position ourselves in a very clear way. In any case, it's also very important to have this, let's say, legal certainty for all the companies, because this would allow them to understand what they should explore further. If, for example, the word manipulation of with subliminal techniques, if this could also fit the targeted advertisements and also deep fakes. If this is banned, it's very important to clarify exactly what it means and what it includes. So I have to say that we are very ambitious. We want to have an AI Act that will work and will make sure we will have control and of artificial intelligence, and it will be complementary to human activity. I also have the feeling that we want to balance the expectations of the private sector, and also to make sure that we will not be left behind in this global tech race. So it's not easy, but even to start the discussion to regulate AI and the internet has been a big ambition, and EU has started this discussion. So I hope we will manage to have the most positive legislation, and hopefully it will become an example to follow globally. I know that it's being anticipated. I know the expectations are high, and I'm very happy to discuss with you, because I don't have the answers. I can tell you what are the debates, and we have to see the limits of our interventions.
Indeed. This is such a great introduction into the dialogue, Eva, because one of the things that the other panelists and myself were also doing as we were preparing is really taking a look at the press release, which basically has the main components of what you've just described. And I'd like to come to first of all, congratulations, because later in the panel, we're also going to dig a little bit deeper into how you've done this work, because this is a tremendous initiative, as you rightly said, and it impacts the life of nearly everyone living on this continent. This much is clear. So so basically, if we understand it correctly, we've essentially got an AI system, right? We're starting the story with looking at this AI system, and it is being classified according to the levels of risk that it poses. And then certain actions, legal obligations, and regulations are applied on the back of that classification system. So Alex, I'm going to turn to you now and give you the floor, because what if classification isn't the only way to address this challenge? Some of the things that you said, like kidnappers and violent acts, in these cases, I think everyone's of the same mind. However, when it comes to the rest of this classification system, is there another way? Alex, you want to take that, followed by Mislav?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and happy to be on this great panel. So I think it's a great accomplishment that we're having this discussion and that there's so much progress. Having been an entrepreneur and also on the research side some time, it's important, like, what is the implication of this? Like, can we drive this forward, that we're accelerating in shaping the technology according to our values, or are we basically slowing things down because we're building more blocks? And I think it's very important to build the bridges. And one risk, for instance, that I saw in the press release and in the document is that if at the moment there are many applications in a high risk area, right? So my question is more, can we maybe rephrase the problem and make some of the application areas show how they can be done in a low risk way? For instance, if you take the medical area, so we see AI as a tool that should amplify the best what humans do. Right. So basically, if you're using AI in the medical space to assist a doctor, it should be seen as another input that you're giving to the doctor to make a decision. Right. So this is the reason why you see today also like a lot of pushbacks to systems that just give you a black box answer and say, hey, you should do X or Y, but it's really how was this conclusion reached, and so on, that you can say, okay, I understand how the analysis is coming from, and I support it. So it's still human in the decision power and responsibility, and I think naturally this evolves to having more explainable AI systems to make that interface more smooth, right? And I see the risk that suddenly many things are labeled as high risk elements, even though they would be just additional inputs to someone making a decision today. And I think if we cannot separate the different things, then suddenly we create a lot of overhead that will slow many people down. And we need to start catching up then, because we lost a lot of speed. So what can we give to companies, to people working on AI systems to make, I would call it like more practical ethics? How can we bake that in by design? How can we show designs of systems that work differently and incentivize them? So one example that I would like to bring also, if you have cameras in public space that monitor, for instance, people flow for safety risks or whatever. So you want to count how many people are in a certain area. Then yes, technically you recognize, are there people, how many? But you can design it in two ways. You can design it that it's a camera that just outputs a number, 10 people, 20 people, whatever. Or you can build it in a way that it streams the video images all the way to a cloud system on the other side of the planet. And then you might analyze the data now or later, right? So I would argue that the first system is much more privacy protecting and more useful. But at the moment, there's no economic incentive to build a system that way. And still people that pursue that approach have the same risk that policy might also change tomorrow again. So in the finance area, there's this principle of these no action letters, where if you do certain things in a certain way, protecting people, you get a no action letter means, yes, you're not in the regulated space, you can go on with your business, and we not randomly change the framework conditions. So economic incentives like this to give certainty to companies would, I think, be very, very useful to foster this. This is why I would, it's easy to say everything health is high risk, but I think that would block a lot of startup and a lot of innovations. I think it should be more differentiated in that part. And ideally, we focus more on the things that over time we grow more and more areas and say, okay, if you do it this way, it's safe, you don't need to worry. It's nothing else than another measurement instrument or another software and so on that's used, right? And so also just to highlight once more, there are systems where autonomous decisions need to be taken, autonomous driving. There is no way that a human can be immediately in the loop. So there's more design time things that you can check. But for most of the other systems where it's basically providing an additional input to an expert, it doesn't change anything on that side. So they should be much more simple to get regulatory certainty than for other parts. So I hope that helps a little bit framing the discussion from our point of view.
We have a question from one of the viewers as well. So essentially, what you're saying in response to the AI classification system, Alex, is whose voices have been considered in this process, and can there be other alternatives to a broad classification strategy? And this is again, then let's continue this discussion with Eva, but somebody here in the audience, Ramya and Sonali, would like to comment on your points, Alex.
A great point, Alex. So one of the things that I think Alex brought out, Shalini, that I wanted to make sure that we address here, I think there are sort of two related concepts, which is sort of well known in the financial world. There's a notion of an inherent risk. And I think as Alex was saying, there are some use cases, some methods which have an inherent risk, but it's not so much the inherent risk that should be of concern. Of course, it should be of concern, but we should be looking at how do we mitigate that risk, right? So, and what are some of those mitigation measures? And again, example that he was using is great, right? So there may be multiple ways of doing it. One of them mitigates the risk better. So we should be looking at, there's an inherent risk in the application itself. Now, contextually, can we allow it for some use cases and not for other use cases to reduce the risk, right? So that's number one. Number two, if there is an inherent risk, can we work with the system in a way that we understand it better? In many of these cases, we don't understand the risk fully. So I know EU and a number of other bodies have this notion of a parallel run. So the notion of a parallel run is you're doing things the normal way, right? So what you have always done, and you also do it with the augmented system, automated system, but it's not making the decisions yet. And you're collecting the data and then evaluating on a quarterly, annual basis as to how effective the system has been, the AI system has been, right? So that's another way to understand and then mitigate the risk. And the third one, which is obviously well known, is the governance aspect, right? So can we take some of these use cases and mitigate them with the appropriate governance? So this is where, again, I think Alex was touching on this, autonomous systems versus augmented systems. If the human is in the loop as opposed to out of the loop, then yes, we could allow more things, but with appropriate training, with appropriate thresholds, so that we also learn, right? So we want to balance this risk with the ability to innovate, right? So I think both need to come together. And I think a risk based evaluation that EU has done is excellent, right? So it's great. Now, I think if we overlay the mitigation aspect and allow more of those use cases, I think that would be even better.
I see. So this is essentially drawing the line between many things, but one of the slices is definitely, is this a fully autonomous system? Or is this an assistive system with the human ultimately as the decision maker? So I think some of this definitely comes back to, I mean, for instance, these two voices of yours and Alex's are bringing a new perspective to this risk classification system. So we cycle back quickly perhaps to Eva and say, Eva, I know from speaking with Gerasimos during the preparation that you've done a tremendous job in terms of pulling in different voices, getting inputs. You have a number of parliamentary mechanisms even, such as the European SME Alliance, Allied for Startups, and you have calls for public consultations. So you have definitely put a lot of work into ensuring that many voices are heard. Based on what you've heard from Alex and Anand, what are the considerations going through your mind now? Like, would you bring in further new discussions around this classification system, or how can that type of a voice also be reflected?
Okay, so let me say that this is the initial draft. So this is the paper that is sent to the Parliament from the Commission. It's being prepared after also taking under consideration the public consultation, which was not amazing, although it was celebrated like 150 or something. I would expect like 10,000 people participating and companies and different ideas. So of course there is room not just to improve, but to completely change the text. So the final text will be a completely different one. This is because we are co-legislators. So you need to have the Commission, the Parliament, and then the Council to accept and adopt this legislative file. So this means we can amend and change everything. So this is also why we participate to events like yours with experts like the ones that are together with us, to listen and see and understand how far this text is going, and or what should be different, and if there is something that has not been pointed out or highlighted by experts, not just the ethical dimension of it, because it's really based on how we can succeed to have ethics by design and to make sure we're going to have safety by design, to be human-centric and trustworthy, but also to be able to say that we're going to have great results, great benefits. It's going to be, there's going to be an industrial strategy where AI systems, we expect to create growth and jobs, and we don't want to create extra fragmentation in this field. Already we have 27 different member states that they are developing and deploying their own strategies. So we have to have minimum standards and requirements in order to create a union for artificial intelligence to be able to succeed. I can tell you that 2016, we had the first report discussing the ethics of artificial intelligence and robotics. And we mentioned the legal challenges and aspects that should be taken under consideration. 2017, there was this, so we called, and this means I traveled a lot. For example, I went to US universities, I went to Asia, I traveled to hear and listen how the technology is developing. And then when I was really concerned about autonomous weapons, me and other colleagues, we called for an ethical framework for the deployment and development of AI systems. So we had the high-level experts group creating this code of conduct initially for engineers, for the ethics committees, also for designers and users. And then, but this is just a code of conduct. And then we have 2019, the file of industrial policy, AI and robotics, where we raised again the ethical issues, and we called for a proper legislative file that now we have received. These are the initial thoughts and the approach. As I said, it could change, but I believe that if we manage to explain, as you rightly said, not to allow gray zones and blurry definitions, what we mean by high risk, and I would say harmful. Harmful means that it should not be autonomous. It should not be left alone to make decisions or give solutions or let's say, change the lives of citizens, allow them or not allow them to have access to a loan, or to be able to have a house or insurance. I have the feeling that this, and then harmful in terms of autonomous weapons, or having your health data exposed, and having insurance companies being able to exclude you from your insurance. These are high risk for what we want to protect in Europe, the fundamental human rights, also to violate completely privacy. I'm not sure if it's accurate to say that still it exists, because with the metadata, I would say basically, you have GDPR, you have a minimum protection thing. It was important that we had GDPR in place, but then with the metadata, basically, if you start connecting dots, I don't know how much privacy is left to protect, but there will be an effort to protect privacy also in these lines. So this file, it follows a resolution that took place, and we called for safeguards, we called for transparency, we called for an independent authority that could at least have access to how the systems, the algorithmic systems work, and to have the possibility of explainability. If you talk about super intelligence, it's not very easy to explain, but there has to be at least an understanding of how the algorithm was written, like what are the metrics that took under consideration to reach a conclusion. So there were several aspects that we included. I just pointed out just a few. So I still think that there is room to change and to improve.
Great.
But the principles and the vision and the target and the aim that we have is to make sure that it's going to be a technology that will benefit citizens, not just the industry. It will protect citizens and the fundamental rights and the quality of life we have in Europe.
That's fantastic. I think at this point, I'm going to slightly change the direction and put the spotlight on some of the other members of the panel. I'd like to start with Mislav. Mislav, you were recently in a panel hearing at the European Commission. You had some impressions. Would you be able to share some of that and take it into the next area, which is what kind of voice do startups and SMEs actually have in this process as far as reality on the ground goes?
Well, as someone who is actually building autonomous support systems, and I want them to be like in sync with European core values, I'm like super glad that we are actually taking this like systematic approach to creating like AI policies and everything. But I would say that we have like a classical example of like premature optimization. So I'm not sure that we are all agree on the principles. And I'm also not sure that basically we took all the right things into consideration. So for example, if we would see what's the vehicle of innovation, I would say that's startups. And we are constantly mixing startups with SMEs. And so even on this panel, so we have a panel that's like SMEs and startups. These are like two completely different things. It's just showing that we don't get it. And then first we got like the AI white paper that there was like no place for startups there. Now we have the AI Act. It goes like really into details. It's pushing so many buzzwords. And I would say the level of literacy about what AI really is, what innovation really is, it's not that high. And that's like what bothers me, because I would just say, let's first agree on like core principles, and then let's talk about classifying high risk versus low risk and so on, because that's just details. If I would just say that, for example, a simple blog post that someone writes about like how to attack someone that's different than you, or how to stop eating because we are all fat and so on, it can do much more harm than many of the AI systems. And it would mean that if you are going to apply the same principles, we should actually just not allow anyone to post anything, to create a web page or whatever, because they can do harm. And I think that we already have in place mechanisms that are saying, if you cause harm, you'll actually be prosecuted or whatever. I just don't see a difference with AI, because AI is just a tool. But I have a problem because I think that the culture of dialogue is very low. I would say the startups and certain associations and so on, we're trying to push this idea and we're trying to educate people to say, look, this is what's important, this is what startup needs and so on. And I would just say, someone who is running startups for the last like 15 years, when I hear these kind of things, when I read, it makes me depressed. Like, it really makes me depressed. Like, we are spending so much time talking about things that really don't matter.
So,
like,
so let's get back to that point. So you said when you see some of the recent developments, it feels depressing, but you haven't stopped with that feeling. You've actually taken action. So let's get a little bit into that, and then let's invite Julia as well into this discussion, because she's also trying to do something and open up the channels of voice. So. What have you done, Mislav, about increasing this visibility and access for startups to policy?
Yeah, so after spending like a lot of time in US and then some in China, you basically learn that startups here don't have a voice. No one actually taught us that we need to be very loud. We need to talk about our vision. We need to talk about how we plan to create value so that we can ask policymakers and other people actually to help us in executing that. So we are very quiet. We have this idea that we just don't want the government and the policymaker interfere with our business and that everything will be okay. But things actually won't be okay, because things like this AI Act, they're just putting so much burden and uncertainty in, like, if you're doing an AI startup right now and something as I am trying to do, like autonomous support systems, all your investors will ask you, look, is it possible? What's the uncertainty that will be brought by the AI Act? Will it be forbidden? Will it be too expensive? Will you even be able to try to build something and so on? So that's why, for example, I founded like this Croatian AI Association, then we founded the European AI Forum, just to gather all the startups and to say, startups and SMEs, it's not the same thing. From the top 10 companies in the world in terms of their market value right now, 8 for 20 years ago, startups. And we in Europe, we just don't see it.
You brought up investors. So investors, a VC would look at regulatory risk. They would say, if a government, so let's say you're a startup and they are examining you to say, okay, if the government starts regulating this startup's industry, will it break the startup? And if you can then show through how you have, and now we go to trust by design, how you have designed for trust by design, perhaps that convinces an investor to invest in you. So there is an advantage to you being part of this regulatory ecosystem.
Yeah, but I just cannot agree on that, because that needs to be decided or judged by someone who has the experience or expertise to judge it. And the problem with innovation is that we are trying to regulate something that was not already invented. How can you actually create policies for the future innovation? That's like in my mind, it makes like completely no sense.
So what would you have policymakers do? Not write any policy?
No, just let's apply common sense. Let's say what kind of things we actually want in Europe, what are our core values. And then let's, when someone builds something that's really successful, that touches lives of millions of people and so on, we'll just calculate, are you actually increasing the quality of their life, or you're harmful? But if you are actually approaching 2 students who are actually just starting a startup in their garage, and you're basically saying, you first need to learn all about the policy, and then you need to get your mom and dad and all your friends to give you money for lawyers so that you can even start building something, that's just stupid.
So hang on, hold on to that thought, because I want to invite now Niniane to have a go at it, because I think that her organization is trying to solve for this problem. So Niniane, why don't you talk about the digital trust label?
Thank you, Shalini. I hope you can all hear me. So it was very interesting to follow now what has been said from Eva, but also Mislav, because that's something we observe in our work every day. We are working with all different kind of stakeholders at the Swiss Digital Initiative Foundation, and I think the basis or the core objective of this new AI Act is to build trustworthy AI, to build an environment, a trustworthy environment, because the trust and the acceptance of new technology is kind of the basis. So the question is, how do we get there? To put, of course, the humans in the center, to reflect on the core values that should be represented also in our technologies, and to find this balance, this balance between innovation on one hand, and on the other hand also regulation. And the difficulty, I think, for the regulation is to regulate something that we don't know exactly in which direction it goes. So it should not hinder this innovation. So the big question, I think also for startups, it's very difficult. The priorities are in their daily business are probably not thinking about what are the policymakers doing, but they have a lot of, daily business to engage with. So what does it actually mean for them, this new AI Policy Act? I think they can't really, in their daily business, invest time or too much time to think and reflect about these actions. And the question is, what exactly can be done? What does it mean? What will be the impact of an EU AI Act? And at the Swiss Digital Initiative, we try to exactly to find the bridge between the different stakeholders, but also between the principles and values, because I think it's important that, and everyone agrees that it's important that certain values, that certain principles should be part of new technologies. But the big question is, how can we enforce that? So regulation is one part. What we are doing, we are thinking and working around the notion of digital trust, and since 2 years, together with our main partner, EPFL, here in Switzerland, and a lot of different industry partners, then university, we are working on a digital trust label. So the label has two objectives. First of all, it's a label for digital services. It's not a label for companies as a whole or startups as a whole, but really it should give users more transparency and information, what is behind this digital service. So for example, make it transparent if there is an algorithmic decision. And second, it should also make sure that a certain standard is respected. And with that, we try to make it's kind of a soft law instrument, because of course it's not regulation, but it's not mandatory, but it's a tool for SMEs, for startups, but also bigger companies to show their users that they are that they do everything to make sure that they offer trustworthy services.
On your website, for example, you're comparing this to the organic food label.
Yes, so it's a mix between a bio label, so it's and an organic food label, because today users, citizens, they don't have really something where they see what is behind these digital services, unless of course you invest time to learn and to learn what is behind these digital services. So we really want to give the users more transparency on one hand, but on the other side, we also say we check whether exactly we check a certain standard. We make sure that this company not just claim they have trustworthy services, but we really try to see in the fields of security, data protection, the reliability of the service, and then the fairness. So is there an algorithm that takes the decision? And if yes, so we make this transparent.
Indeed, and let's have Anand join in and chime in on this, because So Anand, you work with a lot of enterprises in your consulting career. Have you seen interest in them, or what have you observed in terms of, let's say I'm a startup and I have a digital trust label. Someone else is a startup and they don't have this digital trust label. I'm coming to your customer and saying, take me on as an AI partner. Will there be a preference there? And will such a label actually carry weight among your enterprise customers?
Yeah, I would say labeling is one. So if we just sort of step up a little bit, I think there needs to be some level of assurance that it has gone through not necessarily regulation, some kind of a principle, some governance before companies can feel comfortable, right? So this is where I would sort of split. I think, I'm not sure who made the point, Alex or Mislav, around startups versus smaller, medium enterprises, right? So startups, I see them as very different, basically building the AI solutions. And when they're building the AI solutions, the primary focus is to make things work, not so much today, right? So not so much to think about what are all the ways in which it may not work, right? So because the default is, hey, I need to prove that this works. So the data scientists are very focused on, let's get the performance, let's get the accuracy. All of the other parameters that have come to the fore, transparency, explainability, fairness, right, robustness, are all important criteria that at least at the first blush data scientists don't look at, right? So now I think part of what the legislation should be doing is to say that is important, right? So yes, functionality is definitely number one. If there's no functionality, you don't have to worry about the rest, so it's not going to be successful in the market. So once that functionality is there, or as you're thinking about the functionality, you should also be thinking about some of the ways in which this is going to be used. So I know in the startup world, MVP is a very common term, right? So minimum viable product. And then some people have used EVP as exceptional viable product. So I would say EVP should be interpreted more as ethically viable product. So it's not just minimum viable product. Yes, you do need a minimum and functionally viable product, which can make money in the market. But when you are doing that, before you release the MVP, you should also make sure it is EVP, right? So what I mean by that is, in what context is this algorithm, whether it's making algorithmic decision, is it automating? In what context is it being used? Who are the users? So that again brings in, how do I explain the decision to the users, to the regulators, to my business, and so on, to the corporate, which is probably embedding this into a larger solution. All of those things come in if we do some of those assessments, right? So whether it is some kind of a physical harm assessment, more contextual, emotional harm, how the technology gets used, back to our earlier conversation, automated, augmented, what are the human thresholds, all of that need to be in place. And not per se, again, some kind of a labeling, certification, and so on. But that should not be, I guess, the best way to put it is a rubber stamping exercise. So everyone says, oh, I've done my stuff, let me push it through. As long as I check the various boxes, I'm good, and I get a mark, and then I go on and sell. That would defeat the purpose, right? So I'm all for the labels, but I think it needs to be done in a way that there is a process and people are accepting that, and there's a broader acceptance around some of those labeling criteria or the certification criteria. I know a number of organizations are looking at it. I'm not saying that that's not the right way, but I think we need more work there.
It's a very interesting point, because what you say, Anand, feeds directly into productization. And I'd like to briefly bring in Alex back, because see, this is again one of the challenges of current AI application. You get to a POC, wonderful. Many people get to a POC. But beyond that, how many people are actually commercializing these solutions at scale? How many people are actually shipping product to millions of consumers? So Alex, can you come back in and tie this to trust by design, as you were mentioning before?
Yes, so I think it's a very important point, like how do you productize a system. Like in many cases, for instance, you have a great research paper, you show a number of examples that work, that did not work before, but then the step from the research on the academic side all the way to shipping a product that can be used by millions of consumers is not trivial. So if you have an example, a camera-based system, in theory, you have unlimited inputs, right? So I think this is one of the challenges that you have compared to writing classical software programs where you can just test input-output parameters for sanity. Here you can never have all of the data available to prove that it works in all of the cases. So what you need to do is ultimately to get away from this misconception that you just need more data. And I often hear that data is the primary issue. Just if we have more data, we have a competitive advantage. But actually, there are many problems which more data won't solve. You need to change the models. You need to find out where the models are not stable enough, and so on. So you need a lot of actually foundations and tools to build AI systems that are robust, that are reliable, and that are safe. And I think that topic did not get so much attention yet, so it's not kind of a topic that has received a lot of funding and support. And I feel there's still a gap, also which would help startups quite a lot. Like I personally also invested in a few startups, and many fall into this gap that the expectation is there. If you show someone a demo of something, then 1 year later you can maybe ship a product, but it's much harder. You need different engineering approaches as well, and I'm not entirely sure we have already the right setup where you can learn that on a systematic way. So this is something where we're thinking about what is the right thing, and what are the right partners to set up something like this, that we can help next generation of startups, which are often at the interface between, we have a lot of startups coming from the academic field, but it still also applies to other startups from this gap, because most of the time, if you're not able to achieve certain target criteria for robustness, accuracy, and so on, you cannot ship a product. So just from a customer experience point of view, and then of course you have also other aspects as well to consider. And this is something that I feel is not represented well enough in terms of like where we invest strategically. How can we build competencies to make productization of AI systems faster and better and more reliable? Because then I think a lot of the questions won't result in an over-regulation, but rather we have the right tools available to build the systems.
This makes sense. It's a build the right foundation. Before we explore a little bit further on this topic, we have a lot of audience questions. However, I want to slightly turn the direction of the panel again. And this time I'd like to invite Julia to come in. I was actually saving a few questions specifically for her. And this now comes back to tie all of these pieces together to say, Julia, talk about a little bit about your experiences as a privacy professional, what you're doing, also as part of the Mozilla Foundation as a fellow. Which channels are you opening for whom, and what are the considerations you're taking when you think about AI policy? Have you thought about your companies when you advise them? Have you guys thought about this digital trust certification? Have you thought about trust by design? Have you thought about Alex's points on productization and how that ties into to thinking about AI in a certain way? So floor is yours.
Thank you, Shalini. Yeah, so you mentioned at the beginning that I'm both a privacy professional working with small companies in the US, specifically in Silicon Valley, on their privacy compliance. And I'm also a Mozilla Fellow in Residence working on AI governance. And so the way this combines actually, in my mind, perfectly is that I've been working in this field of GDPR compliance for small companies outside of Europe for a while now, and my focus is really on the small ones who don't have their offices in Brussels and who've also already followed the legislative process back in the days when GDPR was negotiated, and were able to adapt pretty quickly, although it's a big adaptation process. But so what I'm looking at is the small ones who didn't have that knowledge before GDPR took effect, and who I advised to how to comply. And why do I do that outside of Europe? So first of all, I'm based in San Francisco. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool European. I do follow European legislative processes pretty intensely. So I knew right away this would affect players outside of Europe. And what I didn't want is that the small ones are left behind. But what I did see indeed is that in the field of GDPR compliance, it was very hard for the small ones to comply quickly enough. They had vendor contracts with the big tech companies who then tended to cancel those contracts because the small ones first of all, they didn't know that this would apply to them because we're far away from Europe here. And but they had to learn, some of them pretty radically, that GDPR is a law that applies to them nonetheless, because they use data of European users, and so personal data. And so this was a learning process that I helped with, and that I still do help with, because a lot of the players only now look at Europe, or now want to launch a product in Europe that they previously had produced only for the American market. So that's when I step in as a privacy professional. And so the Mozilla Foundation then came in and saw, what I showed them, that this would be a legislative act that would apply again to players outside of Europe, because they produce AI systems for the European market, or they have European investors, or, in general, there's a process also, the so-called Brussels effect, it's called like that in academia, that a legislation that is of a high bar in Europe is easier to apply for the rest of the world, because at least it gives one level playing field than all those different regulations that are in place throughout the world. And so what I'm looking at with the support of the Mozilla Foundation is how those small companies outside of Europe can understand and also, technically implement upcoming regulation on AI very early on in their process, in their development process, and how they therefore can actually use their specific advantages, the leanness, their innovative power, the fact that they haven't, they haven't produced. They haven't gathered that many data yet, so they can right away implement lean data management systems that comply with upcoming regulation, and that follow pretty closely what needs to be done in order not to run into trouble. And so the difficult thing with that is, of course, as I said, we're far away from Europe. How is it possible for us here to actually know what's gonna come up in Europe soon? And that is a process, so that, as I initially said, I'm working on together with the Mozilla Foundation. So I'm talking directly to AI building small companies in Silicon Valley. I'm kind of showing them what there is, what's discussed in Brussels, what their advantages could be, how they could implement those systems, and this gives them an advantage, of course. So hopefully they won't be crushed again, as some of them were in the process of GDPR implementation. And so, interestingly, this is funded by a philanthropic player, the Mozilla Foundation. And I think this is also where an interesting aspect comes in. Why would that be beneficial to society? I do think so, very, very strongly, because even more than in other fields of technology, in the field of AI, size clearly matters. the way you collect data and the speed you collect data and troves of data makes you a more powerful actor. And so we're already pretty far down the road of monopolization. So the big tech companies do gather that many data that they, just have a huge advantage building AI systems that work perfectly, or almost too perfectly, and sometimes not at all. But I mean, it's just very convincingly show what they can do, and so we have to make sure that the field of AI systems is diverse, that small players have a say in that and can produce products that give them a role in the market, also to avoid that monopolization, because I think that is really the big danger in the field of AI.
So do you think, Julia, that if one of your client companies can show that they are proactive, that they have invested into learning about, having a voice in, and complying with this new AI policy or AI law, is this a competitive advantage for them? How do you see this?
Well, I mean, it depends which part of the regulation. First of all, I wanted to say that from what I see, the high risk category in this draft law applies to pretty relatively few AI systems. I expected the category high risk to be larger, honestly, and to have less exceptions. I find the exceptions very dangerous, honestly, because like just taking this example that was mentioned at the very beginning by Eva, kidnapping of children. I do think, I mean, this is separate from the SME aspect now, but when a law enforcement agency buys and implements a system that can actually recognize kidnapping on the street, and they say that they only use it for that, they still have that system and it can be abused. So I would opt for a system that doesn't, have that exception right away, or create possibilities for that, because as soon as you have that little loophole, it will be used and it will be abused as well. But I mean, coming back to the SME question, I do think that small players have a big advantage when they manage to implement certain guardrails early on in the development process. It is much easier for them just in terms of like size of their product, and so they should definitely use this in a smart way. They have their access to knowledge, of course, is important, and that's a huge problem. How should they know just as much as Facebook, Google, Amazon, who can follow those processes much more intensely? But this is the task, I think, for a lot of us to make sure that they can access those that knowledge, and also to have a say in the legislative process now, because the law isn't decided yet. We should give them a voice in the development, in the negotiation process.
Absolutely. I was writing exactly this down as you were speaking, that I wanted to go back quickly to Eva. So Eva, you have heard a diversity of voices here. And I think that diversity in general, as Julia is saying, is critical, absolutely critical, that there needs to be a multitude of voices represented in AI, in the field of AI, in the application of AI, in the productization of AI. Where do you see the policymakers falling on this spectrum? Are they well educated in this? Are they comfortable? Do they have literacy around what's going on? What's your take on this?
So it was a very interesting discussion, because it's also, forcing us to think how we should respond to anyone that is anxious about the act. And because I know that the constant criticism for Brussels is that we overregulate Although actually the last 20 years, we don't have update rules for the internet or the e-commerce, but still we overregulate. So I don't think we overregulate. I think what is needed is to have clear, easy rules and make sure we're gonna have a specific protection for the startups. And I agree the definition between startups and SMEs still is not very appropriate. But in the end, we all understand that we need to support this live ecosystem of the startups. And that's why we have the testing possibilities, the sandboxes. We are investing in several pilots, millions of euros centrally and also per member state. And I have the feeling that in the end, because the same criticism we heard for GDPR, but in the end, the startup survived. Mm-hmm. And Julia is working with them, and I think she could tell us plenty of examples on how it seemed so like a mountain to climb, and then you realize that you have to change the design of your system in order to be compliant, and that's it. That's why I said we need to have a clear roadmap. So in the end, we before the pandemic, the understanding of the AI systems, maybe it was at a lower level, but now my colleagues are studying a lot, the ones who have to understand the impact of the technology per sector. They are reading a lot. We have been discussing about this since 2016. I wouldn't question our principles. I wouldn't say that we don't have the same principles. I mean, the democratic and European principles of non-discrimination, non-biases, to not have privacy violations or manipulation of perception, and basically to be legal also online, I think is something that the ones that we agree on, we have concluded after these 5 years of consultation, this is the way forward. And in comparison to US and the access to, to great capital, of course, or China, with no respect of IP rights to any data or no privacy rights, is different than Europe, because Europe wants to lead with quality, and this could create an extra burden indeed. But we are here, and like we did with GDPR, we will make sure that it will not create more friction. The opposite, we will have a harmonized environment and a huge market. So when you come to design solutions with AI systems, and if you're not violating or being unfair or exclude or you risk to harm someone, I think you have to feel that you will be following in any case what's the spirit of this act. And let me remind you that in the beginning of the pandemic, 80% of the data collected at the European level for the ECDC, the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, they couldn't deal with them, the scientists or the startups, to provide solutions because they had different standards. So we have to decide standards. We have to decide that people need to trust the system, so they need to feel that they will not be harmful for them, and that the anxiety, to create more profit for businesses will not be the compass for also for legislators. In the end, I believe it's going to be a very balanced report, and I would be happy to, as I said, this is not the final text. This is something that is there for us to change, since it has plenty of questions that have not been answered. And it also gives time until companies adapt to these standards.
Definitely. What you're doing is not easy work. I think anybody that has tried to put any manner of policy in place would understand that. It's a highly complex and layered activity, just like it is to try to build an AI product and sell it in the market. Ultimately, we belong, all of us, to the same ecosystem. We live on the same continent, and we're trying to all have a good life and make an impact on the future. So these are the things that do tie us together. Anand, you have your hand raised. Please take the floor, and then I would like to call on Katarina after this to summarize quickly, so we can then take one or two key questions that the audience has been consistently asking. Please go ahead, Anand.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, great discussion, great debate here. So one of the things I thought, given all the discussion, might be quite useful, instead of just splitting or thinking through as small, medium enterprises, startups and enterprises and so on, I think a more useful distinction might be I think developers of AI systems. So yes, there are startups which are predominantly startups, but there are also corporates developing these AI systems. So I think it's good to think of what do we need for developers. Then the second area is people, it can be small enterprises, it can be large enterprises, which take some of the things that either startup or their own in-house developers do, but embed them into a much larger system, obviously to make money or to do various things, various decisions. So it's essentially embedded into a larger one. Call them deployers of AI, so adopters of AI or users of AI. So that thing is a second group. And this group obviously sells it to the consumers and citizens. So that's the final group. And of course, as EU thinks through, it is that group that we want to protect, make sure that the fundamental rights are obeyed. But I think thinking through what the deployers need, what the developers need, I think becomes quite important. So for example, I think we had a discussion around principles. I think it is important that the consumers know that the AI is quote unquote unbiased and fair. And again, I can go technically, there are 30 plus definitions of fairness, and it is impossible for any algorithm to be fair across all 30 definitions, so mathematical impossibility. But they just need to be told that yes, due process has been done so that the systems have been certified by some authority, right? Again, private or public, that they have gone through some steps. Then for the middle group, the deployers, again, they need to be comfortable that there is some protection to them if they are using some third-party software, third-party tools, or their own tools, that they can stand behind it, and that there is written liability issues that they have been taken into account so that they can more safely deploy them and not be sued. And that's the biggest issue that many corporations have with respect to, again, some of the more advanced AI. And for the developers, I think it's fine to agree on principles that the software will be fair and unbiased, will be explainable. But you go to a data scientist, what the hell do you mean by that? If there are 30 definitions of fairness, which one do you want me to use? Just tell me an answer, right? So it's at a very different level. So the developers need much more guidance, not necessarily from the regulators. This is where I think Mislav was going, that it's impossible for the regulators to go in at that level of detail, but there needs to be some boundaries where the group itself can define what is good, what is bad, and revolve that over time.
Mm-hmm. This is a very interesting alternative to the framework of thought around the classification system, for example. Julia has something to say, I think, around big corporate versus smaller players. Go ahead, Julia, and then Mislav. But try to keep it short so that we can still get to the audience a bit.
Yeah, I've made a little bit of my point already in the chat. I know the policy making process in Brussels, and how the EP and the Commission and the member states, of course, who I worked with for the biggest in Europe before, how they listen to lobby. And I just wanted to say that a couple of weeks ago, there was a study published that tech influence from big tech is much bigger in Brussels than in any other policy field. That, you know, the discrepancy between a lobbyist is so big. And I just want to highlight that, and also call to MEPs like Eva to make sure that, you know, what the statistics show, they don't listen enough to those voices, but they should. And this is really a field where those, I mean, lobby is never really balanced, but here the discrepancy is much bigger than in other fields. And we just have to really make sure that civil society and small players have a voice. And so philanthropy tries to strengthen those voices, especially for civil society, but it's very hard. And I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Mislav, please go ahead.
Okay, so very fast. I would say that the good laws come as like formalization of good practices. And basically, GDPR is not the same as AI Act. Why? Because GDPR actually came after 30 years of collecting data online and actually learning what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and then actually just making it very clear to the public. And I just don't see how it can be compared to trying to regulate autonomy. Like, who here has actually expertise and experience so that that person can just say, look, I have 30 years of experience in building autonomous systems. I know what's good, what's not good, and I'm ready.
Nobody regulates technology in Europe. We are tech neutral. Nobody regulates technology. We put the rules on how technology can be used. This is a basic principle of Europe. For example, we are business neutral, technology neutral, innovation friendly. So nobody regulates technology. I don't want this to be misunderstood.
No, I know that's like that's what you're proclaiming. It's not like how we all interpret that. It's like we can actually maybe disagree on like how we see the situation or how we read the signals.
I mean, I think the point is clear that you are seeing it obviously from quite a different point of view in terms of what is being regulated and how. I think the important takeaway for the audience is that this discussion is not closed yet, right? The law is not in force yet. So they have avenues by which they can make your sort of point clear to the policymakers. So I don't want to turn this into a debate because we don't have time for that at this point. But I think you've all made your points well. And what is important for the audience really is to know that there are channels through which they can get their voice heard. And Mislav, you are moderating some of these channels. Julia, you are moderating some of these channels as well. What we would like to do is have a moment where Katharina can summarize all the key takeaways from this call. And then perhaps we have enough time for one or two audience questions. So I'd like to hand this over to Katharina, if you would be kind enough to summarize.
Thank you, Shalini. Well, yes, we have received quite a few comments and questions, which are mostly related to the ongoing discussion on potentially harmful applications of AI and the role of startups in this regard. And then Daniel Laupsche sent a question regarding the previous discussion on trust, and he wonders, does trust belong to the European common values? And then he posed another question from another viewpoint. If we have untrusted infrastructure or data processors, how would citizens and customers behave? He said he doesn't want to test this. And then last but not least, we have received a question from Aisha to Eva. She asked, how can we just not give a derogation in the EU AI Act on startups based on the assumption that since they are very small, their reach is limited and the harm they can really cause is minimal? Do you expect this to be discussed at all in the EU Parliament? That would be all from my end. Over to you, Shalini.
Great. So let's take a couple of questions from the audience. All right.
Sorry, Shalini, those were summary of the questions from the audience. So
I see. Okay. Oh, apologize. Okay. Would anybody like to contribute to the summary that Katarina just shared from among the panel? In fact, all the panelists can unmute yourselves and just have a lively discussion for 10 more minutes.
So if I can always respond to the question because I mentioned my name, that of course, as I said, there was a public consultation. I will say it again, it was open for all the companies to participate, all the startups, anyone that defines themselves as a startup or not, and even entrepreneurs themselves to contribute. And in the end, this plays a significant role in the decision making and policy making. It's not easy to have everybody on board in the end. We don't have 100% of agreement. I understand that someone that is eager to set up a company or eager to make a profit might consider this regulatory burden inefficient for them. But in the end, since I'm also participating as member of the board of the Startup Alliance, legal certainty is really important to them. And what they try to do is to make sure there will be sandboxes for them, there will be extra funding. And also, I have the feeling that they understand that taking down the barriers and having a harmonized legislative file like the AI Act at the European level will also remove these barriers and they will not have the frictions that they face of 24 different languages, legal and tax systems. So if you consider the benefit of having such a legislative proposal, I think, and again, the GDPR is not to compare, it's not the same thing, but it has to do with data. And the initial response was like too much burden for startups. And in the end, it was not actually, it protected users and the owners of companies from any liabilities and an understanding of how their own systems work. So in the end, I believe that when we manage to respond to all these questions in detail, and when we explain how and what are the metrics to consider something high risk and have specific extra obligations or not, I believe it will be a very balanced report, as usually is. And I know it's expected, and having quality standards could never be a bad thing. I know that IEEE, the Standards Association, it's a global platform that refers also mainly to engineers, and it can provide with recommendations for specific standards to be taken into consideration, also cybersecurity issues. They themselves created a code of conduct for engineers to have ethics by design when they take over some company to build their infrastructure, their software systems, so that they, by design, without being asked, to include the minimum ethics that we are calling for transparency, for fairness, to not allow bias bias in the data sets that will be training the algorithm should be avoided, and they have to find ways to make sure that this will happen. And still, since AI is not perfect, people are not perfect, people are designing it, they decide the metrics, they decide how the algorithm is being written. We have to make sure that we will protect in the end users, and we will make sure that it will come as a technology that it will help us develop and also create solutions and help us to take better decisions. So this is what we're trying to achieve. And if somebody has specific ideas on that, because criticism has also in the end be translated into amendments that will enter the text, I would welcome that, and we are open to that, as you know. And whoever is interested in the process, please do contact me in my office and social media. Me and my colleagues will be working on this file for the next months to come, and it will take also 2 years until it's implemented.
Fantastic. Thank you for that offer. We have 2 last comments from Alex and Niniane, and then we will close. Alex, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to emphasize one more thing, which was mentioned, I think, by Julia already before. So big tech companies have a strong voice and influence on many stakeholders in the political system. So one of the questions that I'm curious about addressing is that we know that a lot of the business models that the big tech companies are based on are from early 2000, collect a lot of data, then later decide how it can be monetized. And I would say, like, many efforts have been at curbing kind of like the big tech companies with advertising taxes and so on. So I would love to see in the ecosystem, not just more on the legislative side, but also a way of how can we help startups like to be faster, because these are ultimately the ones that are creating new jobs, finding new business models by pivoting left and right. And I believe that the startups that are here are embodying much more the European value. So basically, if we block and slow down the startups that are here, it means just that the innovation will be developed somewhere else, where maybe the norms and the values are different, and we have to import it in the same way that we are today. Basically, the main social networks and so on are not developed here and not shaped according to our values. And I think that's a concern that I have, and where I would love to see more more action also in the future. So if anyone has ideas or want to team up on this, we'll be more than happy to engage.
You've got my attention for sure, Alex. I mean, I definitely feel very Swiss at heart after 13 years here. Totally want to see this region thrive. So I'd be happy to take you up on that. Niniane, would you like to say something?
Yes, so I just wanted to react on the question on, is trust a value, a European value? So I think everyone kind of agrees that what we can observe, not just in the digital world, but also in the analog world, is some kind of a decay of trust, more and more polarized society. And I think it's in no one's interest to live in a world without trust. So the overarching objective that we are trying to achieve is to live in a world or to build the basis for trustworthy AI. And I think this should be in everyone's interest. And regulation can be one part, but we believe that the approach must be much more holistic. So regulation is one part, but then we have heard also from the previous experts here, and then transparency, make transparent when an automated decision is taken, when there's an algorithm taking the decision. Then, of course, the understanding. If you don't understand something, it's very hard to trust. Participation, to include all the voices and the different views. And of course, some kind of an independent authority, making sure that or checking, controlling certain aspects and criteria, and all that together should then foster a trustworthy environment. And I think that's in the interest of all the stakeholders, even though probably different views exist in how to get there, but in the end, I think we all try to achieve the same objective.
Indeed. Maybe one final thing from Anand, if you want to step in here quickly, Anand. A lot of companies these days, a lot of large enterprises as well, are indeed pursuing this trustworthy AI, responsible AI, transparent AI. You have a wide range of enterprise customers. Would you say that this is the case?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is I know we are all AI believers and we are all here. But if you look at the larger corporations, AI is just one component of a much larger system, right? So yes, I mean, there are some AI only companies, right? So in the tech industry, but if you take off the other industry, they are doing something else where AI is one part of it. And I don't think they fully appreciate both the opportunities nor the risks of AI as much as this community understands. And even there, if you go deeper into the data science world, there's a real appreciation of some of the opportunities and risks. So I think as we think through this, it's not so much just AI. So I know trustworthy AI is needed, but so is cybersecurity, and so is the trustworthiness of the data, right? So it's all going together is what is going to give the confidence to the people. And I think we mentioned about social interaction, advertising. I think all of them come together. AI might be there in small parts in some of them, but I think we should look at it holistically. I know it's difficult to look at everything, but I think some of the issues that were brought up in terms of trust, in terms of monopolization of power and how power goes, and what is so special about AI that monopolies can form much faster due to the data network effects. So all those things also need to be considered so that it's not just AI, but broader, how does enterprises deliver value to their customers?
Fantastic. Eva,
yes, just I think a question, because I believe trust is not the value, it's actually the foundation of everything, especially in Europe. Without trust, we wouldn't go to buy medicines from the pharmacy, we wouldn't go to buy food, we wouldn't believe it's like everything that is written there, it's accurate, right? We had to do our own research. So the expectations is, I believe, something that we should consider when we are calling for the legislators to be, let's say, to consider less regulation. So the expectations of citizens, what are they in Europe? Aren't they that when we buy a device, it's safe? Isn't it when we buy food or medicine, it's exactly what it says. It follows the high quality standards and safety standards. When you buy any device that might broke down, don't you expect that Europe will be there and protect you? You're gonna have your rights, and you can you have the right to appeal, you have the right to go to justice, you have the right to claim that you need the better treatment and higher standards. This is something that people expect in Europe. And this is the same thing that they would expect when they are using AI systems. They would expect that in order to be allowed to be open and accessible in Europe, they should be safe and trustworthy. When you go to buy an autonomous vehicle, would you expect that the government would make all the security checks, or would you expect the company should do that? They should self-regulate. You would definitely expect that the government guarantees that this is a safe vehicle for you. So if you understand what are the expectations from regulators and legislators, I think then any specific suggestions would be really valuable for us.
This is just amazing on that note of trust and what it means to what kind of expectations the citizens of a continent have. Because ultimately this whole panel has been talking about thriving and thriving in this continent with systems that work for us, thriving in ways that are innovative, thriving in ways that are designing well for the future, considering the role of big and small players, and so much more. I want to thank all of the panelists for this amazing discussion. I don't know how 90 minutes went by. I think easily another 90 could go by. This is a topic important to all of us, and we could just go on. But we have to close for now, and I think I will call upon Sanja and Aisha and Elliot to close. But thank you everybody who participated and who has thought about these topics and who is here as an audience member today.